Very warm welcome and good day to everyone listening, and thank you SURF 2021 for hosting this event. My name is Klaus Schroeder, a PhD student in the Civil Engineering Department at the University of Texas at Arlington, and today I'm presenting a multi-benefit decision-making framework to evaluate the use of natural and nature-based features for coastal protection that our team, Dr. Hummel, Dr. Bafus, and myself have been working on. The framework seeks to translate the hydrodynamic implications of coastal adaptation strategies into potential costs and benefits relevant to coastal communities. The images on the first slide speak to the major threat that sea level rise and increased coastal flooding as a result of climate change poses to coastal communities around the world. The increased risk of coastal flooding threatens to displace communities and cause substantial damage to infrastructure. In response to these risks and the associated unintended consequences of grey infrastructure to mitigate coastal flooding, such as infrastructure failure, adverse alterations to regional hydro and sediment dynamics, and negative environmental impacts associated with them, the use of natural and nature-based features has become increasingly popular. These features have the advantage of requiring less maintenance than grey infrastructure and may be able to naturally recover after disasters with little to no intervention. The potential flood reduction in terms of extreme flow discharges, waves, tides, and coastal surge, as well as the associated economic benefits of natural and nature-based feature approaches, have clearly warranted further investigation. In our study, we are particularly interested in the hydrodynamics and economic impacts of natural and nature-based features. We further recognize that the costs and benefits associated with adaptation strategies go beyond inundation and economic consequences. Disparities and vulnerability to natural disasters between different socio-demographic groups have been noted and are increasingly highlighted in many regions around the world. Despite its importance, socio-demographic considerations in flood risk assessments, cost-benefit analysis, and other evaluation tools used to evaluate the cost of coastal adaptation strategies remain limited. Our study therefore focuses on exploring the socio-demographic impacts and benefits of natural and nature-based features and grey shoreline infrastructure and the subsequent ramifications for risk assessments used to evaluate the effectiveness and efficiency of coastal adaptation approaches. Our project focuses on Southern California, and as you can see from the slide, for this particular study, we used the densely developed Santa Monica Bay as our case study. With sea level rise in Southern California predicted to rise roughly 2 meters by 2100, it is no surprise that stakeholders in this area have been increasingly interested and concerned with how to best adapt to sea level rise. Both the local government and private organizations have been actively involved with assessing the impacts of sea level rise, as well as implementing and testing adaptation strategies. For instance, to weather the increasing magnitudes of winter coastal storms, the LA County has been constructing sand berms in vulnerable areas along the beach since the 1970s, while non-profit organizations such as the Bay Foundations have been running pilot beach restoration projects that aim to restore ecological functioning of beaches while enhancing its capacity to protect the area from climate change. Initiatives such as these enable us to leverage its networks. More particularly, we leverage the USC's Sea Grants Adapt LA network, which is a regional approach to sea level rise and coastal hazard planning and adaptation, to conduct a workshop where coastal managers, local city planners, and scientists could help inform this work. During this workshop, stakeholders discussed priority areas for sea level rise adaptation. Other general recommendations included focusing modeling efforts on important natural resources like coastal estuaries and lagoons, equity, and protecting homes and beaches identified as vulnerable through an existing hydrodynamic modeling framework developed by the US Geological Survey called the Coastal Storm Modeling System, more commonly known as, or referred to as, COSMOS. The model allows assessments of future coastal flooding exposure by dynamically modeling sea level rise, water levels, and coastal change. The figure on the right here shows an example of the model's outputs for the 3 sea level rise scenarios without any adaptation strategies. The blue representing flooding extent under no sea level rise scenario, the orange being a 0.5 meters sea level rise scenario, and the red being 1.4 meters sea level rise scenario with extensive flooding around Marina del Rey and Venice canals. Based on the stakeholder outcome, a range of adaptation approaches were selected to be modeled. More specifically, as can be seen in the slide, a seawall, a tide gate, as well as strategic sand filling in low-lying, flood-prone areas lower than 4 meters and 5 meters in elevation along the beach, was chosen as a more natural approach. The local and regional hydrodynamic impact of these identified coastal adaptation strategies were then evaluated through implementing the strategies within the Cosmos model and then running the modified model with a 2-meter sea level rise scenario and with a no storm and a 100-year storm. The no-action approach results show that sea level rise and large storm scenarios impact flooding extent, which is especially clear in the Venice canals and the Marina del Rey area. On the other hand, all the implemented adaptation strategies contribute somewhat to reducing the flood extent, with differences in flood patterns between adaptation strategies protecting different parts of the region. To estimate the economic costs and benefits of certain coastal adaptation strategies, we applied FEMA's flood assessment structure tool, abbreviated as FAST. In a nutshell, FAST is an open source tool that calculates building level flood impacts with user provided building and flood depth data. An example of this data is shown in the top left figure, with the red and yellow dots being building stock data and the blue area are flood depth data. The program assigns depth data functions to buildings according to specific building attributes. Flood depth is then extracted at every building and uses a depth damage function parameter to calculate estimated costs pertaining to building loss, content loss, and inventory loss. To identify and compare locations of damage cost, the results of these damage cost estimations can also be geographically visualized. However, due to the way this data set was created, there is inherent uncertainty in the building locations, and the result, therefore, are aggregated at census block level. This facilitated a more straightforward process of comparing and analyzing the data in combination with the socio-demographic impacts that are also captured at census block level. This project uses FEMA's hazardous demographic information developed from 2010 census data stored in SQL tables in congruence with hazardous flood modeling techniques to estimate the total number of people affected by the different coastal flood events and adaptation strategies for multiple socio-demographic categories. This is done by assessing the percentage of flooding found at each census block and then applying that percentage to each demographic category within the census block. Since all the results are aggregated at census block level, there is some unavoidable uncertainty in these results. Therefore, the total amount of people forming part of the various exposed socio-demographic groups is calculated and used to compare the overall socio-demographic impacts and benefits of the relevant coastal adaptation strategies across the various sea level rise scenarios and storm events. For example, the results in our case study illustrate how people from different income and race classes are affected. The total amount of people displaced is also estimated and can be used to evaluate strategies. For example, our results show that the tide gate adaptation strategy to be the most effective in reducing the displacement of people during a 100-year storm. This approach allows us to assess the socio-demographic costs and benefits associated with different adaptation strategies, basically evaluating the equitability of adaptation strategies at hand. So to summarize our approach, this is an overview of the process that we are applying, starting with the stakeholder engagement and then using the modeling approach to understand patterns of flooding, economic damages, and socio-demographic impacts. Given that information, we can evaluate different adaptation alternatives and strategies and iterate through additional stakeholder engagements to select adaptation alternatives that meet the goals and satisfy the priorities of the stakeholders. So in conclusion, we have developed a multi-benefit method for evaluating coastal adaptation options that consider physical damages as well as economic and socio-demographic impacts, in essence promoting a more equitable risk reduction. This method allows us to evaluate both green and grey adaptation options against a broad range of criteria consistent with stakeholder priorities. So looking ahead, our next steps of this project consist of finalizing modeling of our adaptation strategies and holding additional workshops to present the results and again get further feedback from the stakeholders. For your information, here are some references used for this project. And that is it from me today. Thank you very much for listening.